What if the most powerful man in Portland, whose empire stretched from glass towers in New York to hospitals in Seattle, found his world shattered not by rivals or lawsuits, but by a 6-year-old girl standing in the snow, holding a cardboard sign that read, "Find Mom"? If stories of healing, second chances, and unexpected families touch your heart, consider subscribing and staying with us until the very last page of this journey. Jonathan Reed had always believed mornings were meant for precision. His calendar was polished down to the second. Flights, calls, board meetings, everything lined up like dominoes waiting to fall in perfect sequence. But on that winter morning in Portland, Oregon, nothing followed the rules of his carefully constructed world. The snow had begun before dawn, a fine powder drifting down over the sprawling West Hills neighborhood. His estate, a glass and stone fortress overlooking the city, stood silent beneath the weight of white. Security lights cast cold halos across the driveway, and the sound of his driver warming the Bentley hummed faintly through the frosty air. Jonathan adjusted his charcoal overcoat, briefcase in hand, ready to leave for the airport and another meeting in New York. Then he saw her. At the wrought iron gate, barely visible through the drifting flakes, stood a tiny figure, a girl no more than 6. Her coat was ripped at the sleeves, the zipper broken so the fabric flapped open to expose layers of sweaters far too thin for the season. Her shoes didn't match, one sneaker, one rubber boot, and both were caked with ice. Snow had settled into her hair like brittle confetti. She shivered so hard the cardboard in her hands trembled. The sign was scrawled in thick marker, crooked letters pressed onto a torn box. "Find Mom." Jonathan froze. In all his years, through market crashes and hostile takeovers, nothing had disarmed him like this small stranger pressing her plea against the bars of his gate. Her lips were blue from the cold. When she finally lifted her face, her eyes carried a desperate clarity no child should ever have to know. She whispered, voice breaking like glass, "Can you help me, sir?" Something inside him cracked. He tightened his grip on the briefcase. Logic told him to call security, to notify the police, to step back into the warmth of the car and continue his life untouched. But her words cut through the layers of steel and glass he had spent decades building around himself. Jonathan's driver leaned out, voice sharp with irritation. "Mr. Reed, we're running late. Shall I remove her?" Jonathan didn't answer. Instead, he stepped toward the gate, snow crunching beneath his leather shoes. The girl's small hands clung tighter to the sign as if the act of holding it together might hold her entire world from falling apart. "What's your name?" Jonathan asked, his breath visible in the air. "Lily," she said softly. "Lily Harper." Her voice quivered, but the determination behind it was startling. "My mom. She got sick last night. The ambulance came, but they didn't let me ride with her. I waited. I didn't know where else to go." Jonathan glanced at the security keypad, then back at her trembling form. He told himself again he should call someone else to handle this. But when Lily pressed her palm against the iron bars and whispered, "Please," something inside him shifted. The driver checked his watch, impatient. "Mr. Reed." Jonathan lifted a hand to silence him. "Where did they take her?" Jonathan asked. "St. Vincent," Lily said quickly, as though clinging to the one detail she knew for certain. "But I don't know if they'll let me see her. They said she doesn't have insurance." Her words landed like a blade. Jonathan knew the mechanics of the healthcare system too well. Deductibles, exclusions, denied claims. He had built parts of his empire on navigating those very loopholes, but to hear them echoed from the mouth of a freezing child, that was something altogether different. "Come with me," Jonathan heard himself say. The driver blinked. "Sir?" Jonathan opened the gate with his access code. Snow swirled through the gap, and Lily stepped hesitantly inside. She was even smaller up close, the sleeves of her coat hanging over her hands, the fabric stiff with wetness. He crouched to meet her eyes. They were a piercing hazel, wide with fear, yet refusing to surrender. He saw in them not just desperation, but an echo of something he had lost long ago. Faith in someone else to make the world right again. The Bentley's heated interior swallowed them in warmth as they drove toward St. Vincent Hospital. Lily clutched her sign the entire ride, refusing to let go, as though afraid it was the last thread tying her to her mother. Jonathan sat back in silence, heart hammering with a rhythm unfamiliar to him. For decades he had measured his worth in quarterly reports, stock valuations, Forbes covers. But in that moment, with snow still melting on the little girl's lashes, all of it seemed brittle and hollow. When they arrived at the hospital, Jonathan dismissed his driver and escorted Lily inside. The fluorescent lights of the emergency wing flickered against sterile walls. A nurse behind the desk glanced up, weary from the night shift. "Rachel Harper," Lily blurted out. "That's my mom." The nurse frowned. "She was admitted last night. ICU, but visiting hours are restricted and—" Her eyes slid to Lily's torn coat. "Family access requires proof of guardianship." Lily's small hand squeezed Jonathan's. Her grip was ice, but the trust in it was fire. Jonathan knew then that whatever meeting waited in New York could burn to ashes. He would not leave this child to face the storm alone. "I'll sign whatever papers you need," Jonathan said firmly. "For now, she's with me." The nurse hesitated, then handed him a clipboard. As Jonathan filled in his name, the pen trembled slightly in his grasp. He was making the first unauthorized move of his life, not for profit, not for reputation, but for a child he had met less than an hour ago. The ink dried on the paper, but what it sealed was far more than a signature. It was the first fracture in the fortress of Jonathan Reed's carefully curated solitude. And through that fracture, light, fragile, unwelcome, unstoppable, began to seep in. The Bentley's headlights cut through the pre-dawn haze as they pulled into the circular drive of St. Vincent Hospital. Frost clung to the windows of the emergency wing where weary doctors and nurses moved like shadows behind glass. The world of Jonathan Reed, the boardrooms and balance sheets, the billion-dollar negotiations, seemed impossibly far away. Lily's small hand was still wrapped around his. She hadn't let go since they'd left the gate. The cardboard sign was tucked under her arm, soggy from melting snow but clutched like an heirloom. Inside, the sharp smell of antiseptic filled Jonathan's lungs. Monitors beeped in distant rooms, a mechanical chorus of survival. A young nurse at the reception desk looked up, her eyes tired. "Rachel Harper," Lily said, her voice trembling. "She's my mom." The nurse checked the computer. "She's in ICU. Condition is critical. I'm sorry, but only immediate family." Jonathan slid his business card across the counter. The name embossed in silver carried weight even here. "I'll take responsibility for her daughter. I'll sign guardianship papers if that's what it takes." The nurse hesitated. She had seen this name before, in news stories, perhaps even on hospital donation plaques. Finally, she nodded. "Wait here." As she disappeared into the back, Jonathan glanced down at Lily. Her hazel eyes never left the double doors that led toward ICU. He could see her lips moving silently, whispering something like a prayer. Minutes later, paperwork arrived. Without hesitation, Jonathan signed. His pen cut across the lines with the same decisiveness he used for mergers, except this time the stakes were not billions, but a child's right to hold her mother's hand. They were escorted to the ICU wing. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly as they entered. Through the glass, Rachel Harper lay motionless on the bed, tubes and monitors tracing the fragile fight of her body. Lily pressed her palm against the window. "That's her." Her voice cracked. Jonathan felt something constrict inside his chest, the way it hadn't in years, not since the day he buried his own wife. A nurse placed a gentle hand on Lily's shoulder. "You may go in, sweetheart, but only for a few minutes." Lily looked up at Jonathan, searching his face as if for permission. He nodded. Her tiny steps carried her into the room, where she climbed onto the chair beside the bed and grasped her mother's hand. Jonathan stood outside, watching through the glass wall. The contrast was unbearable. He, a man of power, stood in silence, separated by glass, by rules, by everything he had built to keep the world at bay. And on the other side, a child's tears cut through all that distance with a single act of love. The driver texted twice, reminding him of the waiting flight to New York. Jonathan ignored it. Inside the ICU, Lily whispered to her unconscious mother, her small fingers stroking Rachel's knuckles. "Mommy, I found someone. He helped me." "You're not alone anymore." Jonathan's throat tightened. He could almost hear his late wife's voice in that fragile assurance, as though the universe itself were mocking his carefully chosen solitude. The nurse eventually ushered Lily back out. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, but her grip on Jonathan's hand was stronger now. "Will she get better?" Lily asked. Jonathan paused. He had built empires on certainty, on predictions and projections, but here he could offer none. He knelt to her level, searching for the right words. "She's fighting, and we're going to help her fight." Lily's brow furrowed. "But they said no insurance. They said that means no medicine." The words sliced deeper than he expected. Jonathan knew the bureaucracy, how coverage could vanish with a single unchecked box, how lives could be rationed by profit margins. He had overseen contracts that played those very games. He could feel the wall of glass pressing against him, both literal and metaphorical, the barrier between compassion and calculation. For years he had chosen the latter. But now, staring at Lily's trembling face, something fractured. The driver appeared again, whispering insistently, "Sir, the Gulf Stream is waiting. If we don't leave in 10 minutes... Jonathan looked down at Lily, then at the phone in his hand. The scheduled call with investors in Hong Kong blinked across the screen, worth millions in potential gains. "Mr. Reed?" the driver pressed. Jonathan exhaled slowly. Then he put the phone back into his pocket. "No flight," he said. "Not today." The driver blinked, stunned. In all the years he had served Jonathan, he had never heard those words. Lily tugged on Jonathan's sleeve. "Can you stay? Just until Mommy wakes up?" Her plea was simple, but it toppled an empire of excuses inside him. "Yes," he said. "I'll stay." For the first time in decades, Jonathan Reed chose presence over profit. The glass wall had cracked, and through it, warmth began to seep into the cold chambers of his heart. The ICU smelled of bleach and quiet despair. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, painting everything in harsh, sterile white. Jonathan Reed walked down the corridor beside Lily Harper, her hand clinging tightly to his as if he were the last solid ground in a collapsing world. They reached room 217. Through the glass wall, Rachel Harper lay motionless. A ventilator hissed rhythmically, its sound both terrifying and reassuring. Electrodes traced fragile signals across the monitor, each beep marking her stubborn resistance against the darkness. Lily pressed her face against the glass. "That's Mommy," she whispered, her breath fogging the window. Jonathan watched silently. He had attended countless ICU rooms in his life, visiting partners after strokes, rivals after heart attacks. But this was different. This wasn't about corporate succession or insurance payouts. This was about a woman who had been abandoned by the very system he once profited from. A nurse in Navy scrubs approached. Her badge read, Elena Morris, RN. She carried a clipboard and spoke with brisk professionalism. "Are you family?" Lily answered before Jonathan could. "I'm her daughter. He's helping me." She pointed to Jonathan, her voice catching. Nurse Morris scanned Jonathan with the sharp gaze of someone used to evaluating truth beneath layers of presentation. "Without insurance, treatment options are limited. We're stabilizing her for now, but we need to know how bills will be handled." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Provide her with whatever she needs. I'll take responsibility for the costs." The nurse raised an eyebrow. "That's not a small promise, sir. ICU care alone runs thousands per day. Without insurance approval..." Jonathan slipped a black titanium card from his wallet and placed it on the clipboard. "Run this. No delays." For a moment, the nurse's professional detachment faltered. She nodded, her expression softening. "I'll inform Dr. Green," her attending physician. As the nurse walked away, Lily tugged at Jonathan's sleeve. "Does that mean they'll help her? Really help her?" Jonathan crouched to meet her eyes. "Yes. Your mother will get everything she needs now." The relief on Lily's face was brief, fragile as a snowflake. Then she turned back toward the glass, whispering, "Mommy, don't give up." Minutes stretched into hours. Jonathan sat in the waiting chair outside the room, his coat folded neatly beside him. His phone buzzed relentlessly with missed calls. Investors, assistants, board members. He ignored them all. Instead, he watched Lily draw pictures on the back of a hospital form with a blunt crayon she had fished from her pocket. "What are you drawing?" he asked softly. "A house," Lily said without looking up. "With Mommy and me inside. And maybe you." Jonathan's throat tightened. The picture was crooked and simple, 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a roof, but it held more weight than any blueprint of skyscrapers he had ever commissioned. Hours later, Dr. Green arrived, a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and weary eyes. He introduced himself with a firm handshake. "Mr. Reed, Miss Harper. Rachel is stable for now, but her condition is critical. Severe pneumonia complicated by untreated asthma. Without consistent medical coverage, she didn't receive proper preventative care. That's why she collapsed." Jonathan listened intently. "What are her chances?" Dr. Green exhaled. "With aggressive treatment, good, but she will need weeks of support, possibly longer, and will need to prepare for rehabilitation once she recovers." Lily looked up anxiously. "She will wake up, right?" Dr. Green crouched to her level, his expression kind. "We're doing everything we can to make sure she does. She's strong, like you." Jonathan saw Lily's shoulders ease just slightly. It was the first time that day she let herself believe in hope. When the doctor left, Lily crawled into Jonathan's lap without asking. She was trembling from exhaustion. He hesitated only a second before wrapping his arms around her. She smelled faintly of damp wool and hospital disinfectant. Yet in her weight against his chest, Jonathan felt a warmth he had not known in years. As she drifted toward sleep, she murmured, "You're not going to leave me, are you?" The question pierced him. Jonathan had built a reputation on ruthless exits, walking away from failing companies, from people who no longer served his purpose. But here, looking at this child with snow still tangled in her hair, the idea of leaving felt impossible. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. The truth of it surprised him. Later that night, Jonathan signed a temporary guardianship document in the administrative office. The clerk explained the responsibilities. consent for medical procedures, emergency contact rights. His signature bound him not just legally, but morally. For the first time, Jonathan Reed's pen was not writing a deal for profit, but a pledge of protection. Back in the ICU, Lily slept curled on the waiting chair, her cardboard sign tucked against her chest like a shield. Jonathan draped his coat over her small frame and settled in beside her. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, unyielding. Yet in that cold, sterile place, something fragile had begun to glow inside him. It was not the hum of machinery or the rhythm of medical jargon that filled his ears. It was the steady reminder of a child's whispered prayer, "Don't give up." And for the first time in years, Jonathan realized he didn't want to. Portland's skies cleared slightly the next afternoon, but the snow on the ground had turned to dirty slush, coating the sidewalks with a film of gray. Jonathan Reed walked beside Lily Harper through the streets of downtown, her small hand gripping his coat pocket. She had insisted on showing him her home, the place she and her mother had shared before the ambulance came. They turned onto Burnside Street, where the glitter of downtown towers gave way to cracked pavement and sagging roofs. The apartment building stood hunched between a boarded-up laundromat and a pawn shop. Its bricks were damp with moss, windows patched with plastic sheets instead of glass. The lobby smelled faintly of mildew and stale cigarettes. Jonathan paused at the threshold. He had spent decades designing his life, so he would never set foot in a place like this again. But Lily tugged him forward, her small figure determined. "It's this way," she said softly. The stairwell creaked beneath their weight as they climbed to the third floor. Lily fumbled with a keychain shaped like a faded teddy bear before unlocking a peeling blue door. The apartment greeted them with silence. Inside, the air was heavy with neglect. The single bulb in the ceiling flickered, throwing jagged shadows across the cramped space. An old sofa sagged in the corner, its fabric frayed. A heater rattled faintly, struggling to push back the cold. On the counter sat a half-empty box of macaroni, an overturned mug, and a stack of unopened envelopes. Lily's eyes darted around nervously, as if afraid Jonathan might judge her entire world in one glance. "It's not much," she whispered, "but it's home." Jonathan stepped further inside. He noticed the small touches: a crayon drawing taped to the fridge, a blanket folded carefully over the couch, a chipped teacup resting by the sink. They were signs of love stubbornly surviving in scarcity. But the table near the window told a darker story. Jonathan picked up the pile of envelopes. Each one bore red ink. Final notice. Past due. His stomach tightened as he flipped through them. Unpaid utilities, overdue rent, medical bills. At the bottom of the stack lay a foreclosure notice stamped with the county seal. "Mr. Reed?" Lily's voice broke through his thoughts. She held up another letter she had found near the couch. The bold header read, "Eviction hearing, January 12th. Jonathan's pulse slowed. He had seen thousands of such documents, had even signed contracts that resulted in homes like this being taken away. But never had he seen one through the eyes of a child clutching it with trembling fingers. "They said we had to leave," Lily whispered. "But Mommy said she would fix it. She always fixes everything." Her voice cracked on the last word. Jonathan knelt beside her, gently taking the paper from her hands. His gaze drifted back to the foreclosure notice. Something about the language caught his attention. The name of the insurer listed at the bottom. He recognized it instantly. One of the companies tied to a subsidiary under his own conglomerate's umbrella. It wasn't coincidence. It was design. Jonathan felt the air in the apartment shift. A suspicion flickered, dark and unwelcome. Rachel Harper's insurance hadn't simply lapsed. It had been cut, deliberately. He straightened, his mind racing with connections. The foundation he had established years ago, the Reed Charitable Health Fund, was supposed to protect families exactly like this. Yet here was proof that the safety net had been shredded from the inside. "Why would they do this?" Jonathan muttered to himself. Lily tilted her head, confusion clouding her eyes. "Do what?" "Nothing you need to worry about," he said quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. He folded the eviction notice and slipped it into his pocket. As he scanned the room again, his eyes fell on a small box near the sofa. Lily knelt and opened it proudly. Inside were tiny treasures: an old Barbie with missing arms, a cracked snow globe, and a small cupcake sealed in plastic wrap. "Mommy saved this for me," Lily said, lifting it carefully. "She said we'd eat it on my birthday next week, but maybe you can have it now. You helped me." Jonathan stared at the cupcake. Its frosting was hardened, the sprinkles faded. Compared to the extravagant desserts at the galas he attended, it was almost laughable. Yet something about the offering struck him like lightning. He hesitated. "Are you sure?" Lily nodded earnestly. "Mommy said food tastes better when you share it." Jonathan accepted the cupcake. He broke it in half and handed the larger piece back to her. Together they ate in silence, the dry sweetness crumbling on their tongues. For Jonathan, it was the most human meal he had tasted in years. Lily smiled shyly. "See? Not so bad." Jonathan managed a faint smile, though his thoughts were far away. Behind his calm exterior, the realization gnawed at him. Someone within his own company had orchestrated this misery. Someone had manipulated the system to ensure families like Rachel Harper's fell through the cracks. He looked at Lily again, her small frame curled on the couch, her hazel eyes glimmering with stubborn hope. She had no idea she was living inside the consequences of decisions made in glass towers thousands of miles away. Decisions made by men like him. The weight of that truth pressed against his chest until it was hard to breathe. "Mr. Reed?" Lily whispered sleepily, curling into the blanket. "Thank you for coming here. I didn't want to be alone." Jonathan sat beside her until her eyelids fluttered closed. The flickering bulb hummed above, casting the room in uneven light. He looked down at the eviction notice in his pocket, then at the little girl sleeping beside him. For the first time, Jonathan Reed knew he had stepped into something far greater than a simple act of kindness. This was no accident. It was an attack. On Rachel Harper, on her daughter, and perhaps even on the conscience he had long buried, and he intended to find out who was responsible. The following morning, Portland was glazed with ice. The storm had passed, but the temperature plunged overnight, leaving sidewalks brittle and dangerous. Jonathan Reed stood by the frosted window of the Burnside apartment, staring at the cityscape in the distance. From here, the towers of downtown looked less like monuments and more like fortresses. Behind him, Lily Harper shuffled sleepily from the couch, rubbing her eyes. The blanket Jonathan had tucked around her still clung to her shoulders. In her hands, she clutched the cupcake box they had shared the night before. Its wrapper was folded neatly, as though even the memory of sweetness was too precious to throw away. "Good morning," Jonathan said softly, surprising himself with the warmth in his tone. Lily blinked up at him. "Do you always talk that nice in the morning?" He gave a faint smile. "Not always." She grinned, toothy and unguarded, before climbing onto the chair opposite him. She set the cupcake wrapper between them like an offering. "We should save this. Mommy says little things matter the most." Jonathan stared at the hardened crumbs inside. He thought of the 5-star meals he had consumed across Paris, Tokyo, New York. Plates decorated like paintings, flavors engineered for acclaim. Yet none of them had touched him the way that stale cupcake had. Outside, a gust rattled the loose window frame. The cold crept in, chilling the room. Jonathan pulled his scarf tighter, but Lily didn't complain. She simply hugged her knees and whispered, We used to light a candle when it got cold. Mommy said it made the house feel less lonely. Jonathan hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a slim silver lighter, a gift from his late wife. Striking it, he lit the stub of a candle sitting forgotten on the counter. A thin flame flickered to life, casting a fragile glow across the shadows. Lily's eyes widened. See? Warmer already. For a moment, Jonathan let himself believe it, but the fragile peace shattered when he unfolded the eviction notice again. The language was deliberate, targeted. He could almost see the fingerprints of his own executives in the phrasing. These weren't random denials, they were calculated exclusions. The door rattled suddenly. A sharp knock jolted the air. Lily stiffened. "That's Mr. Crane," she whispered. "The landlord." Jonathan opened the door to find a heavy-set man in a wool coat holding a clipboard. His expression softened slightly when he recognized Jonathan from news articles, but his voice remained curt. "Rent's overdue 3 months. Sheriff's notice goes through next week. Place'll be locked up." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "You'll get your rent, with interest." The landlord blinked, uncertain. Jonathan's presence was unexpected in this setting, like a lion stepping into a back alley. He muttered something about policy and trudged off, leaving the smell of stale tobacco behind. When the door shut, Lily's shoulders sagged. "Mommy always said we'd be okay." But she didn't know about this one. She tapped the notice with her finger. Jonathan folded it back into his pocket. "She doesn't need to know right now. What matters is keeping you safe." Lily tilted her head. "Why are you helping us?" The question struck like a blade. For years, Jonathan had believed in transactions. Help was given only when it was earned or profitable. Yet here he was, standing in a crumbling apartment, sharing a child's cupcake and promising safety he wasn't sure he could provide. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think because someone should have helped long before me." Lily studied him with solemn eyes far older than her 6 years. "You're not scared of getting your hands dirty, are you?" Jonathan froze. The words were simple, but they cut deep. All his life he had prided himself on keeping clean. Clean deals, clean exits, clean lines between his empire and the chaos below. But now, a little girl was reminding him that true strength came not from avoiding the dirt, but from choosing to step into it. Her gaze held his until he looked away. Hours later, they returned to the hospital. The ICU still buzzed beneath the fluorescent lights. Rachel's condition had stabilized slightly, though machines continued to dictate her fragile rhythm. Jonathan watched as Lily pressed her drawings against the glass, showing them to her unconscious mother. One picture caught Jonathan's attention. 3 stick figures again, but this time the tallest one wore a tie and carried a briefcase. Jonathan recognized himself instantly. The ice around his chest tightened, then cracked a little more. He stepped aside to call New York. The line connected to his assistant, who sounded flustered. "Mr. Reed, the board is furious. You missed the Hong Kong call. There are whispers, rumors about restructuring the health fund. You need to return immediately." Jonathan's gaze drifted back to Lily, laughing softly as she explained her drawing to the glass. "Not yet," he said firmly. "Sir? Tell them I'll return when I'm ready. And make sure no further decisions are signed without my approval." The assistant sputtered, but Jonathan ended the call. For the first time, he wasn't bound by the ticking clock of shareholders. He was bound by something deeper, by a child who trusted him with her fragile world. That night, back at the Burnside apartment, Lily handed him the last piece of the cupcake, wrapped carefully in foil. "For you," she whispered. Jonathan hesitated, then took a bite. The sweetness was faint, the texture stale. but the moment itself tasted like truth. He realized then, the walls he had built, ice walls of glass towers, contracts, and distance, were no longer unbreakable. A child's simple act of sharing had carved a fracture through them, exposing the man beneath. And through that fracture, for the first time in years, warmth began to pour in. The private jet touched down at Teterboro under a slate-gray New York sky. Snow flurries whipped across the runway, but Jonathan Reed barely noticed. His thoughts were still back in Portland, with a little girl clutching a cardboard sign and a woman lying unconscious under fluorescent lights. Yet duty pulled him eastward. The Reed Foundation board had called an emergency meeting, and whispers of insubordination already buzzed like wasps in the corridors of power. Jonathan stepped into the black sedan waiting for him, jaw set. The city skyline rose like jagged teeth ahead, each tower a monument he had once commanded without question. Inside the headquarters on Madison Avenue, the glass walls gleamed with sterile perfection. Assistants in charcoal suits scurried past, tablets clutched like shields. Jonathan's arrival sent a ripple through the room. He had been absent for days, a first in his career, and the board intended to know why. The mahogany table in the boardroom stretched like a battlefield. Around it sat 12 directors, each face a mask of polished ambition. At the far end, Vice Chairman Edward Carlyle adjusted his cufflinks, his smile too thin to be genuine. Carlyle had been circling Jonathan's seat for years, a predator biding his time. "Jonathan," Carlyle said smoothly, rising to shake his hand. "We were beginning to wonder if you remembered where your office is." A few chuckles broke the tension, but Jonathan didn't smile. He slid into his chair at the head of the table, his presence commanding silence. "Let's get to it." A stack of financial reports lay before him. He flipped through the pages, scanning numbers he once knew by instinct. But buried in the fine print, his eye caught on a detail. The charitable health fund he had established, a program meant to provide coverage for families in crisis, had been slashed by nearly 40% in the last quarter. Entire categories of applicants had been streamlined, a sterile word for something far darker. Jonathan looked up sharply. "Who authorized these cuts?" Carlyle cleared his throat. "The board acted in your absence. Rising costs demanded adjustments. Efficiency is key in times like these." "Efficiency?" Jonathan's voice cut like ice. "You're telling me families like the Harpers were excluded because of efficiency?" A murmur rippled around the table. Some directors glanced at their notes, others at Carlyle. Jonathan slammed the report shut. "These are not numbers. These are people. Mothers, fathers, children. We promised them protection. Instead, you buried them in loopholes." Carlyle leaned back, feigning calm. "Jonathan, you've always been a visionary. But vision doesn't pay dividends. Compassion has its place, so long as it doesn't drain the shareholders." The words struck like a hammer. Jonathan remembered Lily's fragile voice whispering, "They said no insurance means no medicine." He could almost see her face pressed to the ICU glass, his fists clenched. If this board is willing to sacrifice lives for margins, then it has lost the right to call itself a foundation. Carlyle's smile flickered. "Be careful, Jonathan. Passion makes men reckless. You've already missed critical calls, canceled flights. Investors are uneasy. Some say you've gone soft." The insult lingered in the air. Years ago, Jonathan would have deflected with polished arrogance. But now, he thought of Lily's drawing, the three figures holding hands beneath a crooked roof. For the first time, he welcomed the accusation. "Soft?" Jonathan said quietly. "No, awake." Silence fell. The directors shifted uncomfortably. Carlyle steepled his fingers. "If you insist on interfering, then prove it. Show us why one family deserves to disrupt an entire system. Jonathan's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced down. A text from an unfamiliar number. Rachel Harper. ICU status update. Please call. The words blurred. His pulse surged. Without thinking, he excused himself from the meeting and stepped into the hall. The call connected. Nurse Morris's voice came through, urgent but steady. Mr. Reed, Rachel Harper's condition is stabilizing, but she remains critical. We'll need consent for further procedures. Are you still her legal guardian? Yes, Jonathan said firmly. Do whatever is necessary. Spare no expense. When he hung up, the weight of the boardroom felt like chains. He paced the corridor, staring out over Madison Avenue. The world below bustled in perfect indifference. For the first time in his career, Jonathan felt torn between two lives: the empire he had built with relentless precision, and the fragile trust of a little girl who believed he could save her mother. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Lily herself, dictated no doubt with the help of Nurse Morris. Hi, Mr. Reed. Mommy squeezed my hand today. I told her you're helping. Thank you. Don't forget me. Jonathan's throat tightened. He pressed the phone to his chest, closing his eyes. The sterile glass towers, the polished boardroom, the empty applause. They had never moved him. But a child's shaky text had pierced him to the core. He turned back toward the boardroom. Carlyle raised an eyebrow as Jonathan re-entered, his expression smug. Well, was that more important than your seat at this table? Jonathan looked around at the faces staring at him. For years he had measured his worth by their approval. Not anymore. Yes, he said simply. And for the first time in his life, he meant it. The storm swept across Vermont like a living creature, roaring down from the Green Mountains and swallowing everything in white. Interstate 89 was nearly invisible, the highway signs half buried in snowdrifts. Jonathan Reed's chauffeured SUV crept along, its wipers struggling against the onslaught. Inside, the air was warm, but Jonathan could not shake the weight pressing on his chest. Lily Harper sat in the back seat, her legs tucked beneath her, a notepad on her lap. She had been drawing since they left New York, her crayons scattered like jewels on the leather seat. Jonathan glanced in the mirror. On the page, Lily had drawn 3 stick figures again, holding hands beneath a crooked triangle. At the top, in shaky letters, she had written, Home. For reasons he couldn't explain, it pierced him more deeply than any hostile takeover or courtroom battle. Do you think Mommy will come here one day? Lily asked suddenly, her voice small, hopeful. Jonathan cleared his throat. When she's stronger, yes. Vermont has clean air. She would like it. Lily nodded solemnly, as though filing his words away like a promise. By the time they reached the Hilton in Burlington, the storm had grown vicious. The wind clawed at their coats as they hurried inside. The lobby was crowded with executives and lobbyists, their polished shoes leaving trails of slush on the marble. Tension hung in the air, flight delays, postponed meetings, but when Jonathan entered with a small child clinging to his hand, all conversation faltered. Vice Chairman Carlyle was waiting. His face tightened the instant he saw Lily. Jonathan, he said under his breath, what is this? A prop? She's with me, Jonathan said flatly. Carlyle's jaw worked. This is an international conference. Insurers, pharmaceutical leaders. We cannot parade. I said she stays. Jonathan's tone ended the conversation. Lily, oblivious to the undercurrents, looked up at Carlyle with wide eyes. I'm not a distraction, she said softly but clearly. I'm someone who needs help, just like Mommy. A hush fell over the lobby. Some executives shifted uncomfortably. Others turned away, unable to meet her gaze. Jonathan felt a surge of pride, not for himself, but for her, the smallest voice in the room cutting through the noise of polished lies. Later, in the conference hall, long tables were spread with thick contracts, each page filled with dense clauses and jargon. Carlyle began his presentation, his voice smooth, almost oily, describing cost-saving exclusions as though they were gifts. Jonathan skimmed the documents, his stomach tightening. Beside him, Lily colored quietly, but at one point she frowned at a page. "Mr. Reed?" she whispered, tugging on his sleeve. "This number doesn't add up." Jonathan looked down. She had circled a simple line in red crayon. 5 + 3 = 9. He blinked. She wasn't pointing to the legal jargon, but to a basic addition error in the margin, the kind of sloppy mistake used to camouflage something deeper. Jonathan's pulse quickened. He ran his eyes down the column. Hidden beneath the numbers was a deduction that should never have been there, deliberately inflating costs to funnel millions into a private account. A child had caught what armies of lawyers had buried. Jonathan rose abruptly. "This clause is fraudulent," he announced, his voice echoing off the walls. He slammed the contract down on the table. Carlyle's expression froze. "You misunderstand." "No," Jonathan cut him off. He gestured to Lily. "Even a child saw the inconsistency. That's how brazen this has become." Whispers erupted across the hall. Executives leaned over, flipping through their copies, frowning as they saw the highlighted error. Carlyle's face darkened with fury. After the session ended, Jonathan led Lily back to their suite. Outside, the storm howled, rattling the windows. He lit the fireplace, its flames struggling against the draft. Lily curled beside him, wrapped in his scarf. For a moment, the fire warmed more than the room. It thawed something deep within him. Then came the knock. Jonathan opened the door to find two men in dark coats, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They shoved him back into the room before he could react. One grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against the wall. "This is a warning," the taller one hissed. "Stay out of the fund. Stop digging. Next time, it won't just be paperwork that gets buried." Jonathan fought back, fists swinging, but years of boardrooms had dulled his reflexes. The shorter man raised a fist, ready to strike, and then Lily's voice rang out, sharp and fearless. "He's the only one helping my mom. You can't hurt him." The men froze. For an instant, the storm outside seemed to roar in unison with her cry. Neighbors began pounding on the walls, alarmed by the noise. The intruders exchanged a glance, then slipped out into the blizzard as quickly as they had come. Jonathan slammed the door shut, chest heaving. He turned to find Lily trembling, but standing tall, her small fists clenched. He knelt, pulling her into his arms. She pressed her face into his chest, whispering fiercely, "Don't let them scare you. Mommy needs you." Jonathan closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of crayons and ash. In that moment, the final ice within him shattered. He had lived too long behind glass, untouchable, unfeeling. But this child's courage, this unshakable faith, had awakened something stronger than fear. "I won't stop," he said hoarsely. "Not for Carlyle, not for anyone. We'll fight this. Together." The storm raged on, battering the windows, but inside that fragile circle of firelight, Jonathan Reed realized he was no longer alone. And in the back of his mind, he also realized something else. Carlyle had not simply stumbled upon the scheme. He had eyes everywhere. If Jonathan was attacked in Vermont, it meant Carlyle had been tracking him for days, watching, waiting. The battle was far from over, but Jonathan had a reason now, two reasons in fact, to fight until the very end. The jet landed in New York under a low, iron sky. Manhattan's skyline loomed ahead, its glass towers glittering like weapons in the winter light. Jonathan Reed stepped off the tarmac with Lily Harper in tow. She clung to his hand, the cardboard sign tucked under her arm as though it were armor. The attack in Vermont still burned in his mind. Two men in dark coats, their words sharp as knives. "Stay out of the fund." Jonathan had replayed the scene a dozen times on the flight back. They had known his location. That was no coincidence. Carlyle was watching him. By morning, Jonathan was back at Reed Tower. His assistant tried to bury him in schedules, but Jonathan brushed her off. "Keep Lily safe in my office," he ordered. "She's not to leave your sight." Then he took the elevator down, past the executive floors, past the archives known only to a handful of staff, into the underbelly of the building. The door required 3 codes and his fingerprint. When it clicked open, he stepped into silence. Rows of steel cabinets stretched beneath flickering fluorescent bulbs. Dust hovered in the filtered air. It smelled of paper, ink, and secrets. Jonathan had built this archive years ago to preserve sensitive contracts. Now it felt like a mausoleum for the lives buried under fine print. He moved quickly, pulling boxes stamped with the Foundation's crest. Inside were claim files, audits, payout charts. The language was cold, bureaucratic. But his eyes picked out the patterns, whole categories of families, single mothers, part-time workers, whistleblowers, systematically excluded. He clenched his jaw. This was no clerical error. It was deliberate cruelty disguised as efficiency. At the bottom of one box, he found a sealed envelope. Confidential, internal audit. His pulse quickened. He tore it open and unfolded the papers. The first page bore Rachel Harper's name. Jonathan froze. Line after line, the words blurred into a story that turned his stomach. Rachel had once worked for a pharmaceutical supplier connected to Reed Foundation contracts. She had flagged irregularities, overbilling, inflated drug prices, treatments charged but never provided. She had filed a complaint, believing the system would protect her. Instead, retaliation had come swiftly. Her health coverage terminated, her name blacklisted, she and Lily left exposed. Jonathan staggered back into a chair, gripping the file. She tried to stop them, and they punished her for it. A faint hum broke the silence. He looked up sharply. One of the cameras in the corner, installed years ago for security, was glowing red. Jonathan's blood ran cold. Carlyle had eyes even here. He switched off the light, stuffed the file into his briefcase, and crouched behind a cabinet. Moments later, footsteps echoed in the hall. 2 figures entered, flashlights sweeping across the cabinets. Carlyle's voice carried in a low growl. "I told you he'd come here." "He's predictable when he thinks he's clever." Jonathan's heart pounded. He pressed himself against the steel cabinet, every muscle taut. The second man, one of Carlyle's enforcers, grunted. "What if he already saw the Harper file?" Carlyle's tone hardened. "Then we accelerate. If Reed keeps digging, it all collapses. The Harper case was supposed to disappear years ago." The enforcer hesitated. "And the girl?" For a moment, silence. Then Carlyle's reply, cold as glass. "She's leverage. Nothing more." Jonathan's fists clenched. Rage coursed through him, hotter than fear, heavier than despair. He had spent his life believing power was built in boardrooms, but here, in the dark of his own tower, he saw the truth. Carlyle's empire was built on silence and intimidation. The footsteps retreated. Jonathan waited until the door slammed shut, then exhaled shakily. His pulse thundered in his ears. He looked at the Harper file in his briefcase. Evidence enough to burn Carlyle's world to ashes, if he could survive long enough to use it. When he returned upstairs, Lily was asleep on the couch in his office, her crayons scattered around her. She had drawn another picture, 3 figures holding hands beneath a blazing sun. She had scrawled a word above them in uneven letters, together. Jonathan sat beside her, the briefcase heavy at his feet. For years he had cried in silence only for himself, rarely, and in secret. But tonight, he wept openly, tears burning tracks down his face. Lily stirred. Her hazel eyes blinked open. She saw the tears, and without hesitation, climbed into his lap.
"It's okay," she whispered. "We're not alone."
Jonathan held her tightly, the Harper file crushed between his arm and her small frame.
"Yes,"
he whispered hoarsely. Together. Always. Through the window, Manhattan glittered, cold, indifferent. But Jonathan Reed, once the master of glass towers, no longer saw monuments. He saw a battlefield. And with Rachel's name in his hands and Lily's trust in his arms, he vowed he would not stop until Carlyle's empire crumbled. The morning of the hearing broke gray and cold, the kind of New York winter that bit through layers of wool and steel. Outside the federal courthouse on Pearl Street, news vans lined the sidewalks, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Reporters huddled together, microphones ready, their breath visible in the frigid air. Jonathan Reed stepped from the black sedan, shoulders squared, a folder of evidence tucked beneath his arm. Flashes burst instantly, photographers desperate to capture the fallen titan now poised as whistleblower. But Jonathan did not flinch. For the first time in decades, he had nothing to sell, nothing to defend, only truth to deliver. Beside him, Lily Harper held his hand tightly. She wore a borrowed winter coat, her cardboard sign pressed flat against her chest. The letters were crooked, faded from snow and rain, but still legible. Find Mom. Today those words were no longer just a child's plea. They were a symbol of every family silenced by corporate greed. Inside, the marble atrium echoed with footsteps and murmurs. The hearing chamber was packed, journalists, advocates, victims, executives. The buzz of anticipation was electric. At the center sat Judge Eleanor Walsh, known for her sharp mind and intolerance for theatrics. Carlyle was already there, seated with his attorneys, his tailored suit immaculate, his smile razor-thin. He greeted Jonathan with a nod that barely concealed his contempt. The proceedings began. Lawyers for the foundation spoke first, painting the cuts as necessary restructuring. Their arguments were smooth, polished, rehearsed, but Jonathan had once mastered that language too. He recognized its hollowness. When his turn came, Jonathan rose slowly. The room fell silent. He laid the folder on the table and opened it with deliberate care. "These are not numbers," he said, his voice steady but raw. "They are names, families, lives." He held up Rachel Harper's file. This woman reported fraud, doctored billing, inflated drug prices. Instead of protection, she was punished. Her coverage was cut. Her daughter left standing in the snow with nothing but a sign that read, "Find Mom." Gasps rippled across the room. Jonathan gestured toward Lily, who stood bravely by his side. The cameras clicked furiously. "I founded this fund to serve as a shield," Jonathan continued, "but it was twisted into a weapon, and those responsible sit in this very room." He turned his gaze directly on Carlyle. Carlyle's attorney objected, but the judge raised her hand. "Let him finish." Jonathan lifted another document, the confidential audit, stamped and initialed by Carlyle himself. "This shows the targeted exclusions, single mothers, whistleblowers, families already vulnerable, entire groups systematically erased to protect profit margins." Carlyle's face tightened, a flicker of panic breaking through his mask. Jonathan's voice grew firmer. I will not stand by while children like Lily are left outside in the cold, begging strangers to find their mothers. Not when I have the power to change it. At that, Lily stepped forward. She held her cardboard sign high above her head, her small arms trembling but unyielding. The courtroom fell into a hush so complete that even the hum of the cameras stopped.
This isn't just my mom,
she said, her voice fragile but clear.
It's all the moms, all the kids. Please, don't let them take people away anymore.
The judge leaned forward, eyes glistening. Child, what is your name?
Lily Harper. And why did you bring that sign today? Because it worked once, Lily whispered. And maybe it will work for everyone else too.
The gallery erupted in applause, quickly hushed by the gavel. But the message was already etched into every heart present. Carlyle rose, sputtering about defamation and board authority, but the tide had turned. The evidence was irrefutable. The optics, lethal. His allies shifted uncomfortably, their loyalty cracking under the weight of public shame. Judge Walsh's voice rang clear. This court finds sufficient grounds to open a full federal inquiry into the Reed Foundation's insurance practices. Effective immediately, assets are frozen pending review. Whistleblower protections will be enforced. And Mr. Reed, this court recognizes your standing as both witness and petitioner. Jonathan exhaled slowly, the weight lifting from his shoulders like thawing ice. He had come not as a CEO, but as a father in all but name, and the court had heard him. Reporters swarmed as he exited the courthouse, microphones thrust forward. Mr. Reed, is this the end of your career? Jonathan glanced at Lily, who still clutched her sign. He smiled faintly. It's not the end. It's the beginning of something better. Lily tugged on his sleeve. Did we win? He crouched beside her, eye level with her hopeful gaze. We did more than win, Lily. We told the truth. And that's how everything changes. Together they stepped into the icy air, hand in hand. Behind them, the towers of New York loomed cold and indifferent. But for the first time, Jonathan felt the warmth of a fire kindling not just for him, but for every child who had ever been left in the snow. Winter lingered long in Portland, Oregon, though the storms had eased. Snow still clung to the branches of the Douglas firs, but now the sunlight broke through more often, scattering diamonds across the frozen ground. Jonathan Reed stood at the edge of a quiet property just outside the city, a small cedar house tucked against a line of evergreens. Smoke curled from the chimney, mingling with the crisp mountain air. It was not a mansion, not a glass tower. It was simple, warm, alive. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth. Lily Harper sat cross-legged on the rug, humming as she drew with her crayons. Rachel Harper, thinner but stronger after weeks of recovery, rested on the sofa with a blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes, though still weary, shone with gratitude each time they drifted to Jonathan. She had come home. The doctors at St. Vincent had called it a recovery bordering on miraculous, helped by access to the best treatment money could provide, but also by the fierce determination of a woman who refused to leave her daughter alone in the world. Jonathan had stayed every step of the way. He had sat through the nights of uncertainty, fielded calls from lawyers and regulators, faced Carlyle's wrath in boardrooms and courtrooms. And when the federal inquiry finally froze Carlyle out and transferred control of the foundation back to Jonathan, he knew exactly what to do. He had dismantled the old structure, brick by brick, and rebuilt it in Lily's image, a foundation for children, for families left voiceless, for every mother who had once clutched her chest in fear of a denied claim. Now, here in this modest house, the battle scars seemed distant. The sound of Lily's laughter drowned out the ghosts of sterile boardrooms and marble court halls. Jonathan crouched beside the fire, feeding in another log. Sparks leapt upward, chasing warmth into every corner of the room.
"Chimney's drawing well," Rachel said softly.
He smiled faintly. "Better than the ones in Vermont. That sweet nearly smoked us out." Rachel chuckled, then winced slightly, placing a hand against her ribs. Jonathan was at her side instantly. "Easy," he said gently. "Doctor cleared you, but you're not invincible yet." She met his gaze, steady despite the pallor still clinging to her skin.
"I wouldn't be here at all if not for you."
Jonathan shook his head. "You would have found a way. You're stronger than anyone I've ever known." Her lips curved into the faintest smile.
"Maybe. But Lily, she needed someone. And you showed up."
As if summoned by her name, Lily bounded over, holding up a piece of cardboard. Jonathan's breath caught when he recognized it, the same sign she had held outside his gate on that first morning. The edges were bent, the letters faded, but it was intact. "I changed it," Lily announced proudly. She flipped the cardboard around. On the back, in bright crayon strokes, she had scrawled, "Found Mom." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. Jonathan swallowed hard, his throat thick. Lily propped the sign on the mantel above the fireplace. "That way, we'll never forget." The three of them sat together on the rug as the firelight danced against the walls. Lily nestled between them, her small hands linking their larger ones. For a moment, no words were needed. The silence was full, alive, the kind that came only when broken pieces had been mended with something stronger than before. Later, as the snow fell softly outside, Rachel whispered, "What now, Jonathan? You've walked away from the empire you built. What's left for you?" Jonathan stared into the flames. For decades, he had chased power, status, recognition, things that had never filled the hollow places inside him. Now, with Lily leaning against his shoulder and Rachel watching him with quiet trust, the answer came easily. "This," he said simply. "This is enough." He turned to Rachel, his voice lower, steadier. "I thought I needed skyscrapers to feel alive. But all I needed was a fire and a home, and people I could fight for." Tears slipped silently down Rachel's cheeks. She squeezed his hand, and for the first time, Jonathan allowed himself to believe in a future not defined by contracts, but by connection. The flames popped softly, and Lily let out a sleepy yawn. She curled against Jonathan's chest, whispering drowsily,
"We're a family now, right?"
Jonathan pressed a kiss to her hair. "Yes, Lily. A family. Always." And as the fire roared gently in the hearth, the snow outside no longer seemed so cold. The sign above the mantel, once a desperate plea, now glowed in the firelight as a testament. Love and justice can melt even the hardest ice. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of Jonathan, Rachel, and little Lily's journey. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing so you won't miss the next tale of healing, hope, and second chances.